Let's start in 2013. In the heart of Central Asia, Chinese President Xi Jinping announces a plan that will reshape the 21st century. The Belt and Road Initiative. A project of unprecedented scale. A modern-day Silk Road designed to connect China with over 70 countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa. With a price tag exceeding $1 trillion, it stands as the largest infrastructure project in human history. Western analysts were baffled. Why is China spending $1 trillion on roads and ports in other countries? They saw a bold economic strategy, a geopolitical power play, but they were asking the wrong question. The right question is, what happened 500 years ago that China is trying to reverse? Because this story doesn't start in 2013. It doesn't even start in China. It starts in 1492, in Spain, with a man who never set foot in China. And a single voyage that accidentally shattered Chinese dominance for 5 centuries. His name was Christopher Columbus. And he didn't discover America. He accidentally created modern China. This is the story of how trying to avoid one empire led to the conquest of continents, how breaking a trade monopoly shifted the center of the world, and how one voyage in 1492 is the reason China is the superpower it is today. To understand, we must rewind. Not to 1492, but further back. To 1453. May 29th. The ancient walls of Constantinople, a bastion of Christendom for over 1,000 years, are breached. The city falls to the Ottoman Empire, led by the formidable Sultan, Mehmed II. For a millennium, Constantinople had been the gateway between East and West, the golden bridge between Europe and Asia. Now, it belonged to the Ottomans, and Europe panicked. Why? The answer is trade. For centuries, Europe had a voracious appetite for the treasures of the East. Silk from China, spices like pepper and cloves from India and the Spice Islands, porcelain, and tea. It all flowed along one primary route, the legendary Silk Road. And now, the Ottomans controlled its most critical choke points. Every single trade route from the East now passed through their territory. The Ottomans weren't just gatekeepers. They were masters of commerce. They didn't just control the roads. They controlled the prices. Want Chinese silk? Pay the Ottoman tax. Want Indian spices? Pay the Ottoman fee. Want to trade with Asia? Go through Ottoman checkpoints. Europe had no choice. It was economically hostage. But this wasn't just about money. It was existential. The Pope himself lamented. The Muslims have taken one of Christianity's 2 eyes. Constantinople was the eastern eye of the Christian world. Rome was the western eye. Now, the gateway to the East was in the hands of a rival faith and a rival empire. At this moment in history, Europe was a fractured continent. It was poor, divided, and constantly at war with itself. The great powers of the world lay elsewhere. The Ottoman Empire was at its zenith. The Mughal Empire in India was a beacon of wealth and culture. And the Ming dynasty in China was, without question, the richest and most advanced civilization on Earth. Europe was struggling, a peripheral player completely dependent on a trade route it didn't control. Something had to change. Enter a man born just 2 years after the fall of Constantinople, Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus. He grew up in a Europe gripped by fear of Ottoman power and obsessed with finding a way around it. He was a brilliant navigator, a self-taught scholar who devoured maps and travelogues, and he had a radical idea. What if we sail around the Muslims? Columbus, like all educated men of his time, knew the earth was round. He believed he could reach the riches of Asia, the Indies, by sailing west across the Atlantic. His pitch to the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, was simple and powerful. Let me sail west. I will reach India and China by sea. We will break the Ottoman monopoly on trade. We will make Spain rich, and we will outflank our rivals. And here's the key, he explicitly framed this as a crusade. His own diary states his goal was to find a route to the Indies, to end the Muslim monopoly on Eastern trade. This was not just a commercial proposal. It was a geopolitical and religious mission. The timing was perfect. 1492 was the same year that Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, fell to Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the They were on a mission to consolidate Christian power. Columbus's plan fit perfectly into their vision. They gave him 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a clear mission: bypass the Muslims, reach China. On October 12, 1492, after a grueling voyage, Columbus's crew spotted land. He made landfall in the Bahamas, convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He hadn't. He called the native people Indians, believing he was in the East Indies. He wasn't. He was 7,000 miles off course. But he didn't know that yet. What Columbus had actually found was a new world, 2 continents completely unknown to Europeans: the Americas, and these lands were filled with resources beyond Europe's wildest dreams. Gold, silver, vast tracts of fertile land. And, crucially, there were absolutely 0 Ottomans controlling the trade routes. Mission accomplished. By complete and utter accident, Spain didn't just find new land. They found new wealth on an unimaginable scale. Within 50 years, Spanish galleons were hauling tons of gold and silver from the mines of the Americas back to Europe. Not tons, as in a lot. Literal metric tons. Between 1500 and 1650, an estimated 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver flowed from the New World to the Old. To put that in perspective, this was more precious metal than had existed in all of Europe before Columbus. Europe, which had been poor for centuries, was suddenly flooded with capital. This American wealth funded everything. It paid for armies and navies. It built universities and cathedrals. It financed the explosion of art and science we call the Renaissance. It fueled the technological advancements of the scientific revolution. Everything we associate with European advancement was built on a foundation of American gold and silver. The world was being rewired. 6 years after Columbus's voyage, in 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully sailed around Africa and reached India by sea. Now Europe had 2 ways to bypass the Silk Road. First, west to the Americas for raw resources and wealth. Second, south around Africa for direct sea trade with India and the Spice Islands. The Ottoman monopoly was shattered. For the first time in history, Europe didn't need the Silk Road. It didn't need to trade through Muslim lands. It had its own routes, its own wealth. The center of economic power began its slow, inexorable shift from east to west. Now here's what nobody talks about. China didn't even notice this was happening. In 1492, the Ming dynasty was the richest, most powerful, and most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. It had been for 2,000 years. China accounted for 30 to 35% of the entire world's economy. They didn't need Europe. Europe needed them. The voyages of their great admiral, Zheng He, decades earlier, had dwarfed Columbus's expedition. But China had chosen to look inward, confident in its own superiority. But as European ships began bypassing the Silk Road, the consequences rippled across the globe. Ottoman tax revenue plummeted. Less trade meant less money for the empire that had once been the world's great middleman, and China. China lost its biggest customers. European demand for Chinese goods like silk and porcelain didn't vanish, but now the silver to pay for it came from the Americas, and it flowed on European ships. The wealth that used to trickle along the Silk Road, enriching every merchant and kingdom along the way, now stayed in European hands. This is the beginning of what historians call the Great Divergence. For 1,500 years, China and India had been the undisputed economic centers of the world. After 1500, that began to reverse. Not immediately, but slowly, over centuries. The 1600s saw the rise of the Dutch and their global shipping empire. The 1700s belonged to the British, who built a global empire on trade and sea power. By the 1800s, Europe, armed with industrial technology funded by colonial wealth, was colonizing most of the world. By 1800, China finally realized something was deeply wrong. European ships were arriving on its shores with better cannons, better technology, and far more money. China's share of the global economy was shrinking. Not because China was getting poorer in absolute terms, but because Europe was getting exponentially richer. Then came the century of humiliation. The Opium Wars, unequal treaties, foreign occupation. But that humiliation didn't start with a British gunboat in the 1840s. It started in 1492, when Columbus broke the old trade routes, and the world's wealth began to flow in a new direction. Fast forward to September 2013. Xi Jinping stands in Kazakhstan and announces, "We will rebuild the Silk Road." The Belt and Road Initiative. $1 trillion. 70 countries, roads, rails, and ports connecting China to the world. Western media called it confusing. Why spend so much? Because China remembers what happened when it lost control of the world's trade routes. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about infrastructure. It's about reversing 1492. Columbus broke China's connection to the world by creating new routes. China is now rebuilding those connections, but on its own terms. The Belt is the land route, the new Silk Road, through Central Asia. The road is the maritime router chain of ports, through Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, bypassing traditional Western-controlled sea lanes. China is methodically recreating the trade dominance it lost when Columbus sailed west. Today, the economic center of the world is shifting again. Back from west to east. 500 years later, the lesson is clear. Columbus didn't discover anything. He accidentally broke a 2,000-year-old economic system. He was trying to avoid the Ottomans, and he ended up creating the foundation for European colonial empires. He was trying to reach China, and he ended up triggering its long decline. He was trying to find spices, and he found continents. None of it was the plan. And now, China is spending $1 trillion to undo what Columbus did. Not through conquest, but through commerce. Not through violence, but through infrastructure. They are rebuilding what was broken in 1492. And this time, they are in control. So when you hear about the Belt and Road Initiative, don't just think China is building roads. Think, China is reversing Columbus. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.